welcome everybody. I think we're going to start. There is some drink over there and food if you want to grab something. Lovely. Let's begin. So to begin with, I'd like to express our deep gratitude to Virginia Foster, who has generously endowed this annual lecture series, the David Foster Memorial Lecture, in memory of her husband, su amado David. Thanks to Virginia, this afternoon will be the beginning, I'm sure, of a great tradition that will further enrich the intellectual life of Silk and the university. I will not, I promise, rehearse this afternoon the enormous debts that scholars in Hispanic studies, gender and queer studies, media studies, and various other fields happily owe David Foster. I would, however, suggest, given the occasion and pointing to a sliver, and just a sliver, of his astonishingly copious list of publications, that one way of describing David's intellectual journey is to see it as beginning with the cosmopolitan Argentine Jorge Luis Borges. But then we watch how, through the decades, this trajectory wanders helix-like back to Borges in photography, to Borges in Buenos Aires, and to the Jewish intellectual and cultural traditions that blossomed in that city and in Latin America more generally. Further, both Borges and David savored and defended these traditions in strikingly ingenious and ethical ways. Put another way, Borges, David might have said, or probably did say somewhere or sometime, I didn't have 5 weeks to follow all the possibilities. Borges, David might have said, was his alpha and omega, or better yet, his aleph and his tav. Here I'm alluding, of course, to Borges' 1945 short story, El Aleph, in which the narrator encounters, beneath a step in the basement of a house in Buenos Aires of a mediocre poet, a house about to be demolished, an Aleph. That is what Jewish mysticism and Hermetic philosophy conceive of as a physical object, and that paradoxically, impossibly, miraculously contains the infinities of time and space. An object that both crystallizes and shatters memory. The Aleph was for Borges, for David, and I would suggest for us here this afternoon, honoring David's memory, the elusive but all too human ideal. Permit me then to cite the narrator's description of his inimitable experience. Under the step, toward the right, I saw a small iridescent sphere of almost unbearable brightness. At first I thought it was spinning. Then I realized that the movement was an illusion produced by the dizzying spectacles inside it. The Aleph was probably 2 or 3 centimeters in diameter, but universal space was contained inside it with no diminution in size. Each thing, the glass surface of a mirror, let us say, was infinite things, because I could clearly see it from every point of the cosmos. I saw the populous sea, saw dawn and dusk, saw the multitudes of the Americas, saw a silvery spider web at the center of a black pyramid, saw a broken labyrinth, it was London, remember this is 1945, saw endless eyes, all very close, studying themselves in me as though in a mirror, saw all the mirrors on the planet and none of them reflecting me, saw in the courtyard of Calle Soler the same tiles I'd seen 20 years before in the entryway of a house in Fray Bentos, saw clusters of grapes, snow, tobacco, veins of metal, water vapor, saw convex equatorial deserts and their every grain of sand, saw a woman in Inverness whom I shall never forget. And of course it goes on. David, for his part, saw Alephs everywhere, in literature, in city streets, in the flotsam and jetsam of history, in photographs, in the tango. And like Borges, he admired, studied, and defended Jewish intellectual culture with a Kabbalistic spirit that discovered seemingly infinite possibilities in letters and cultures. Our speaker today, Ariana Huberman, Associate Professor of Spanish at Haverford College, has in her scholarship charted new courses in the wake of the likes of Borges and Foster. Focusing mainly, but not exclusively, on Latin American Jewish literature and culture, she has published articles and books that explore cultural translation, immigration and diaspora, identity and nation, and travel narratives in Latin American literature. Her second book, and I guess we have a copy right here, Keeping the Mystery Alive, Jewish Mysticism in Latin American Cultural Production, appeared just this September. In it, she examines Jewish mysticism in Latin American literature, film, and art from the perspective of literary and cultural studies. More particularly, Professor Huberman goes beyond the Borgesian model in order to rethink the engagement with Kabbalah in Latin American culture. At once erudite and accessible, her book exemplifies the virtues of transcultural and interdisciplinary scholarship. As such, we very much look forward to her lecture this afternoon, which is titled Jewish Mysticism in Latin American Literature and Art, Beyond Borges. Please welcome her. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher, for that lovely presentation and for helping me by giving all these context on Borges. So buenas tardes, good afternoon. I am grateful to be delivering this talk in honor of David William Foster. He was a beacon in the field of Latin American Jewish studies and a mentor to so many peers and students. He was so big in our field, I didn't know he was even bigger at ASU. So I'm really impressed to see his name everywhere in the lounge, the graduate student lounge. And thank you so much, Virginia Foster, for making this possible, and for all the family members present today. I also would like to thank Professor Juan Gil Osle, who was the person that invited me and helped me navigate everything to be here, and to the School of International Letters and Cultures for hosting me today. So the intersection between Jewish studies and Latin American studies is not only the focus of my professional career, but it is also reflecting who I am. I am a Latin American Jew from Argentina. I am one of those Jewish Buenos Aires people that David Foster used to introduce to the world. I will start by telling you briefly about my intellectual journey and about my experience writing my latest book, the one that Christopher just showed you. Then I will go over some key definitions before I discuss some of its highlights. Jewish mysticism in Latin America is a subject that is mostly associated with Jorge Luis Borges. But the group of authors and artists inspired by Kabbalah and Hasidism is broader. The purpose of this book is to explore their work and to open up these aspects of their writing and art to readers and audiences who may or may not be familiar with Jewish mysticism. I understand that we have some graduate students and faculty in the audience, as well as members from the Jewish community. My presentation attempts to reach all of you, but the subject can get quite obscure at times. Thank goodness we have Hava here who can help you when things get too obscure. And I also promise I will do my best to clarify things during the question and answer period. So my story begins in graduate school at NYU, where I suffered a fair amount of imposter syndrome. I think that's sort of part of being in graduate school, or at least that was my experience. Is it me? Help. Don't think I touched anything, but it's at the back. Should we plug and unplug and... Ah, there you go. Maybe stay closer. I won't touch it. Okay. Should I keep going? Or? This probably had something to do with the fact that I started grad school in the mid-90s, and I insisted on approaching literature through artisanal close readings, seeking intimate connections between text and social contexts. Unfortunately for me, literary studies was on the way out. It was in the midst of a takeover by cultural studies. So traditional approaches were on their way out. Now, don't get me wrong. I appreciate what theory has to offer. It certainly helps us be more sophisticated readers. But my heart beats for literature and art, not theory. And yet, I'm glad I went through boot camp because it gave me the tools I needed to do well in my career. For my dissertation, I'd like to show you my slides. Should I wait? Keep going? Well, for my dissertation, I wrote about the gaucho figure in 19th century Argentine rural narratives. And for those of you who are not familiar with the gauchos, to say very simply, are the cowboys of Argentina, but it's a lot more complicated than that. That's why I wrote the whole book about it. So please read it. And in that book, I worked with translation theory to trace the process of erosion to cultural boundaries that takes place when the gaucho interacts with European travelers and immigrants. Later on, I developed my doctoral dissertation into a book named Gauchos and Foreigners. And one of the chapters focuses on Alberto Gershunov. Still no luck? I do want to show pictures of Alberto Gershunov. All right, I'll take a minute. Okay. This one will. Wanting to.
It's this wall connection.
That's the connection. Hey. Let's see. Hopefully it will stay. Okay. So that's a book. Let's show a picture quickly. That's Alberto Gershunov. He pioneered the field of Latin American Jewish letters with a compilation of short stories about the Jewish gauchos of the Pampas that is widely read to this day. And my grandfather was one of those Jewish gauchos. Not in the picture, but you get the idea. Now, that was my first incursion into this field. And when I heard about the Latin American Jewish Studies Association holding a conference at Princeton that year, I decided to attend. Now, that conference was life-changing for me. Compared to LASA, the Latin American Studies Association, or the MLA conferences, the Modern Language Association conference, this meeting was much smaller and it felt more inviting. Also, LACSA has a collaborative culture across disciplines. It instantly felt like home. And that sense of belonging persists to this day. I have been part of the board for over 10 years, and I am involved in many of LACSA's initiatives. I hope that those of you who are graduate students here seek peer groups like these. I truly believe that peer support is more generative than competition. So even though I have been mostly invested in Jewish studies in Latin America since that first LACSA conference in the late 90s, I have not forgotten about the gauchos. I still teach about the construction of the national icon and its many iterations in my classes. In terms of research, after Gershonov and his Jewish gauchos, I went on to write a few articles on Margot Glantz, Anna Maria Shua, Sergio Chaifek, in connection to Holocaust studies and the concept of Jewish memory. And then, one day, I entered the world of Jewish mysticism, and I have been chasing its traces in Latin American literature and art ever since. All I remember is that it started with Alejandro Jodorowsky, and 16 years later, a month ago to be precise, he produced this book. Wait to touch it. Now, I promise I will tell you about it very soon. But first, I want to share you about my writing process. So this summer, as I was taking advantage of summer break to start preparing for this talk, I was also getting ready to teach the seminar for Spanish majors. We have a few less Spanish majors in ASU, just a few. I already told some of you, because I know it's shocking, but my entire college has 1,200 students. So we have fewer majors, yes, much fewer. But they do have to write a thesis, and I'm teaching that seminar for the first time. So I decided to start the course with helping to get students excited about the process of writing. I read a few books that I hope will inspire them to get their work done, not only in an efficient way, but maintaining a sense of sanity and hopefully also experiencing some joy. That got me thinking that it might be helpful to share with you not just the findings of my research, but also the process, because writing this book was by far the most rewarding, most difficult, and wonderful experience of my academic career. No previous publication made me grow and learn this much. Given the amount of teaching that I do and how much I choose to invest in it, the only way I can get myself to work on research is by committing to present at conferences. So most of this book was written as conference papers. Over time, as I started finding more authors and artists that were inspired by Jewish mysticism, I became convinced that I could put together a book on this subject. So I wrote an outline. I'm going to start going through the slides so you catch them when you can. Faster than I was planning, but just in case. So I wrote an outline, and I started being more strategic in choosing topics to help me advance the project. Now, the panels and conference topics sometimes also influence what I chose to write about. And as I was putting together the book, it definitely did not look this neat. I wrote pieces, like putting together a panel, a puzzle. But once I had parts of each chapter and a whole summer to focus on this project, it was 2020 after all, I put the papers together, and that is when I realized that my Frankenstein was only 40% in English. So I had to translate everything else from Spanish. And that was no fun at all for me. Some people in the audience, including our beloved David Foster, love to translate. I don't know if I love it or not. I'm just not very good at it. So I had to get help with that as well. Now I think I'm ready to tell you about my book. Jewish mysticism is, for the most part, uncharted territory in the field of Latin American Jewish studies. And that is what this book attempts to address. It introduces the work of Latin American authors and artists who have been inspired by Jewish mysticism from the 1960s to the present. This is where I show you pictures of the authors. So Alejandro Jodorowsky, a Chilean writer and filmmaker who lives in France, Mario Satz, an Argentine writer and scholar who lives in Spain, Angelina Muñiz-Huberman, a Mexican author who was born in France, and Isaac Goldenberg, a Peruvian author who resides in New York City. Of special interest are Jodorowsky's multimedia approach to Jewish mysticism, which borders on exoticism, Satz's Kabbalistic exegesis, Muñiz-Huberman's exploration of angels and becoming one with the divine in her writings, as well as Goldenberg's various renderings of wandering souls. I also study artwork from Alejandro Schulz Solar and Mirta Ferming, both from Argentina. Not like. Okay. What do you say? We give up? It's just not working, huh?
Connection's bad at the wall.
Okay. All right. So I just showed you pictures of the authors now, and now I'm showing you pictures of the artists. I wonder if I can just show you my computer, but I'm not sure. Okay. Here are the authors. Okay. All right. Those were the artists, actually. Okay. So, given the limited time we have here today, I will discuss how the themes fit in the Latin American canon, the theoretical framework, and I will offer definitions of Kabbalah and Hasidism, and then I will share some of the work I've done with representations of angels in Muñiz-Huberman's chapter. Now, I chose this section because it was one of my favorite topics while doing my research. A question that often comes up as I presented parts of this work at conferences was the relevance of these authors' publications on Jewish mysticism for the Latin American canon. So what does this topic have anything to do with Latin America? It was a very common topic. Or in Jewish studies conferences, why are you talking about Jewish studies when your PhD is in Spanish and Latin America? So I have no idea why I kept pushing through, but maybe just like I'm doing right now with the presentation, it's in my nature. I just keep going, and a book came out of that. I also did pay attention to the questions. Honestly, I do answer those questions in the book. And part of the question on how do these publications fit into the Latin American canon, I'm going to share with you right now. So while all the authors that I study were born or have lived most of their lives in Latin America and published in Spanish, the materials that I discuss here, for the most part, do not relate directly to the Latin American context in which these authors grew up, and where some still reside. Most of the authors I study live abroad. They're transnational authors whose personal lives inform their literature. I don't believe that these questions are placed in the Latin American canon. On the contrary, it makes them stand out, especially if we follow Borges on this point. So, in his famous essay, The Argentine Writer and Tradition, Borges criticizes early 20th century intellectuals for defining the Argentine canon as a field fit only for authors who write reproducing Argentine cultural aspects, topics, and linguistic regionalisms in order to belong to the national canon. In fact, he proposes that local flavor comes across more genuinely when the writer or artist does not have that purpose in mind. He asserts that anything an Argentine writer publishes belongs to the Argentine tradition. By extension, I believe that anything written by a Latin American author is Latin American literature, whether written specifically about Latin America or not. The authors that I study in my book should also be considered as part of the Spanish, French, and US canons, which is not uncommon with transnational authors. Their transnational life experiences are not the central focus of my book, and yet they play a role in the tendency that these authors share to connect the dots between different cultural expressions. In addition, the hybrid nature of Latin American culture, which consists of indigenous, Spanish, Christian, Muslim, Asian, African, and the rest of the cultural wealth, brought by free migration and forced relocation to this continent, has shaped the Jewish experience and cultural productions of Jews in Latin America. Jorge Luis Borges is one of the most salient figures in Latin American literature, and before my book, he was the only author that received serious academic attention for the presence of Kabbalah in his writing. In addition to the Kabbalistic themes that appear in his famous stories, such as Death and the Compass, the Aleph, and in essays like A Vindication of the Kabbalah, most critics look at the impact it has had on his writing. For example, Itzhak Lewis invites us to read Borges as a Kabbalistic storyteller, and his dissertation is a comparison of Borges and Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, as including Kabbalah in the way he tells the story, not just name-dropping concepts of Kabbalah. The bibliography you can see includes 6 books and articles titled somewhere around Borges and the Kabbalah. And I will share, maybe I'll just share the slide set with the department and they can share with you. So you can see the bibliography. And this is just a sample, there's more. But as Saul Sosnowski shows, there is an important difference between the Kabbalist's faith involved in studying the Torah and Borges' ludic approach. It's completely different. Yes. For the theoretical framework, I rely on multiple disciplines: literary criticism, film, history, art criticism, Jewish studies, and contemporary Kabbalah scholarship to discuss the different levels of engagement that these secular authors and artists have with central themes from Jewish mysticism. Since my doctorate is in Spanish and Latin American literature and cultures, I have no professional training in Jewish studies, and I did not have a religious upbringing. My book is conducted within the field of literary and cultural studies. But this book project required that I studied aspects of Jewish mysticism that flourished in these artists' work. For this purpose, I relied on the academic work of scholars who belong to the area of Jewish studies, initiated by Gershom Scholem, as well as on Hasidic scholarship. And Hava Samuelson, did I say it right this time? Is one of the people I cite. Arthur Green, there's Moshe Idel, all the main figures in Jewish studies. Now, some of you may know or not, but this was by far the most difficult part of the project, was finding the happy place between citing and how to cite people from Jewish studies and rabbis and scholars from contemporary Hasidic scholarship, because these are two fields of scholarship that do not dialogue much, and they're very different. I can tell you more if you're interested. So in terms of the body of work studied here, strictly speaking, this book is about Latin American Jewish literature and art, because it focuses on Jewish themes, whether the artists themselves consider themselves Jewish or not. These writers and artists are inspired by the familiarity with Kabbalah at different levels. Some have engaged in studies of Jewish mysticism much more extensively than others. So, for example, Sad studied at Hebrew University with Gershom Scholem, and Muñiz-Huberman and Goldenberg have both read, as well as confirming, all have read extensively, both Gershom Scholem and directly from primary sources. Now, these writers and artists are inspired by their familiarity with Kabbalah at different levels. Oh, I just read that. So, but they all approach Jewish mysticism from a secular perspective. And that's one of the most interesting parts, is that they're all secular authors and artists, and they all are readers of Scholem and his followers, or detractors. But the actual art and literature that they produce resonates much more with Hasidic scholarship, with the scholarship of believers. It has that passion that philosophy does not necessarily convey in the same way. So their work stands as proof that Jewish mysticism is a powerful source of creative inspiration that can reach everyone, regardless of the person's religious orientation or level of observance. No luck. So Jewish mysticism includes Kabbalah and Hasidism. Hasidism is a movement within Orthodox Judaism that in the 18th century revived Eastern European Jewry, inviting the unlearned masses to connect with God through faith, ecstatic prayer, and joy. Before then, Torah studies were considered the only way to reach God, a privilege that only few could afford. This left large parts of the population disenfranchised. Kabbalah is an intrinsic part of the Hasidic movement. The term Kabbalah comes from the Hebrew word meaning tradition or received knowledge, and Sholem defines it as the traditional and most commonly used term for the esoteric teachings of Judaism and for Jewish mysticism, especially the forms which it assumed in the Middle Ages from the 12th century onward. Mysticism seeks to transform the relationship between man and God from a dogmatic knowledge to an intuitive experience that is more alive. Teachings should be implied, not asserted, and while it is grounded on Torah and tradition, it is continually evolving because it is open to interpretation, which explains why in Kabbalah there are so many schools of thought. Among the most common topics in Kabbalah are religious ecstasy, unity between the soul and God, prophetic knowledge, the ascension of the soul to the celestial throne, as well as meditation, contemplation, and angelology. And finally, we make it to the angels. So having grown up in a Catholic country, the topic of angels provoked a deep fascination in me, because it is not central or even present in contemporary Jewish practice. I honestly believe that angels, like saints, belong to Christianity. That's how secular I am. But I discovered that angels have populated Jewish texts throughout time. According to Sholem, angels were prominent in Merkabah literature between the years 200 and 700, although remnants of this form of esotericism can be traced well into the Middle Ages. Different systems of angels appear in the writings of 13th and 14th century authors. This is in addition to the traditional angelology that includes Michael, Raphael, and Gabriel, among others. Rachel Elior summarizes the different ways angels appear in Jewish literature as follows. Thank God the computer is working for this slide. It requires an angel. These celestial beings are variously referred to as the holiest of the holy ones, congregation of Elim, sons, children of Elim, sons of heaven, holy angels, chief princes, priests of the inner sanctum, servants, angels of the countenance, spirits of knowledge, lords, and hosts of angels. They perform the sacred service in the supernal Heihalot, and I'll show you the definition in the next slide. I took too long. And are associated in many ways with the order of creation, the cycles of the universe, the traditions of priesthood, the sevenfold cycles of the temple cult, and their mythological origins. Just a quick definition, Heihalot, meaning temples, palaces, or halls, is a term that refers to an early form of esotericism before proper Kabbalah. The symbolism of angels also shifts and evolves in the writings of Angelina Muñiz-Huberman. In Las Raíces y las Ramas, she discusses Maimonides' conception of the universe as a series of concentric spheres with souls with independent intelligence. She compares these spheres with angels or divine intermediaries in Jewish tradition. In her poem titled Angel, she offers a more fluid and abstract definition. She defines an angel by what he does not do or what he doesn't have. Now, I will read from the poem in Spanish, and I was going to let you read the English translation, but I think I'm going to do both. because I don't think you can see the translation. So there we go. So, no cruza el mar sino vuela, no sube la montaña sino se posa. La verdad es que tampoco tiene voz. La música que lo anuncia no es suya, sino de las altas esferas del amor. Música que no es suya ni tampoco suena. Música de campanilleros antes de empezar. Sin forma, sin color, sin recipiente. Lo que se puede decir de él es lo que no es. This is okay. It does not cross the seas but flies. It does not climb the mountain but alights. Truth is, it does not have a voice either. The music announcing him is not his, but of the high spheres of love. A music that is not his, nor sounds, a music of bell ringers before the start, without form, without color, without container. Only what he is not, one can say of him. So this is the language used to describe God in negative theological terms. Extending this description to angels highlights the fact that even though angels in the Bible are not meant to aid God, sometimes they act in an adversarial or independent manner. Also, by putting the emphasis on what the angel is not, he becomes a vessel of significance, which is how Muñiz-Huberman refers to Paul Klee's famous painting, Angelus Novus, in her book, Arrhythmias. She has a story titled Angelus Novus. I'm referring here to a story in which Muñiz-Huberman brings Paul Klee's famous painting to life. Her recreation of the Angelus follows Walter Benjamin's lucid interpretation of Klee's painting as the angel of history, with eyes wide open to the horrors of the Great War. In an impasse between past and future, thrown towards future by a storm sent from paradise that forces him to move on, and I quote, the tempest we call progress. But she goes beyond. He's the angel of history, of contradiction, of irony, of void. He's the angel of all angels, a messenger, indecisive, solitary, sure of himself, lost among men, in no man's land, a traveling angel, a human angel, angel human, trapped, without a destiny, without hope. In sum, un ángel de múltiples interpretaciones, an angel of multiple interpretations. Her text ends citing the ninth thesis on the concept of history. Benjamin's Angelus Novus is scarred by humanity. He has become a vessel of all interpretations, a mirror of humanity's good and evil. He has a life of his own. This is why I also became interested in Jules Solar's numerous representations of angels. His art intrigues the viewer. It depends on the viewer's active gaze, and that is how it relates to angels as vessels of interpretations in Muñiz-Huberman's literature and also in Judaism, as we saw with Rachel Elliore's quotation. Elliore's quotation resonates with Jules Solar's representation of angels, which take many forms in his paintings. And while stylistically not all of them resemble Paul Klee's art, the uncanny tension of the Angelus Novus caught in mid-flight finds echoes in Jules Solar's paintings. For example, Dos Anjos portrays two angels who seem conflicted, with anger in their eyes. They are surrounded as though they were trapped by fluid shapes. Their flight is interrupted, yet they're looking forward, determined to get through obstacles. From their hands and heads irradiates a source of energy. They reflect a luminosity that inspires optimism. They may be able to make it through, but the image focuses on the conflict, the interruption, the tension between intent and obstacle. Different from Klee's Angelus, the obstacle is in front of them, not behind them. The conflict is not part of history, but in the present time. But the conflicted conflicted aura of the Angelus is present in Dos Anjos. These angels are caught in conflict. In El Ángel del Karma, we can get a taste of Jules Solar's stylistic affinity with Paul Klee's art, although this affinity is even more evident in other artwork. Interestingly, while they were contemporaries and there is some dispute on whether they met or even knew each other's art, there's some evidence that they met in Munich, maybe in the 20s, not sure. People are not sure. So. But it is unlikely. There's not enough documentation. So in El Ángel del Karma, the geometric lines imply movement. The arrows are a symbol of the angel's influence on the human's figure on the left, a karmic response to human's action. In fact, this angel is pure action. The conflict in this painting is the humans. The angel himself does not appear conflicted as it does in Klee's Angelus or in Dos Anjos. These examples show how the angel appears as a vessel of meanings, a vessel of all interpretations, both in Jules Solar's art and in Muñiz-Huberman's writing. And they also reveal how the angel is more malleable in secular artistic expression than in contemporary Kabbalah. But even in that field, angels vary. Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz advances the idea that the substantial quality of an angel may be an impulse or a drive, say, an inclination in the direction of love, or a seizure of fear or pity or the like. Interestingly, so this is one quotation that shows that this is also true in contemporary Kabbalah. So interestingly, the bond that connects Muñiz-Huberman and Jules Solar's depiction of angels in the context of Jewish tradition is not contemporary Kabbalah or even Jewish studies. It's Paul Klee, a non-Jew. Benjamin's interpretation of the Angelus Novus as the angel of history, caught between past and future, inspired the painting's many artistic echoes. They are angels in conflict, and Benjamin argues that as hybrid beings positioned between heaven and earth, angels symbolize the eternal conflict between the spiritual and the secular. Therefore, while the angels in Muñiz-Huberman's literature and Jules Solar's paintings do not necessarily represent the meaning angels have in the Torah, they're a clear sign that angels continue to evolve in Jewish culture. Benjamin's insight on Klee's Angelus Novus captures the transformative essence of angels in Judaism, and this is also true for angels in Latin American literature and art. The Latin American literary production that deals with Jewish mysticism, which started with Borges, is not limited to the authors discussed in this book. Other Latin American authors and artists have produced works with varying degrees of engagement in Jewish mysticism. Argentine author and journalist Marcos Ricardo Barnatán has written essays, poems, and narratives that refer directly or tangentially to this topic. Costa Rican author and artist Rosita Galina published several books of short stories and poems that include riddles and codes that need to be deciphered, with allusions to the Kabbalah, as well as representations of the golem. Juana Garcia Abbas is a Cuban poet whose poems in Circunloquio resonate with the Sefer Yetzirah and Gematria. Mexican author Esther Seligson traces the history of the Jewish people through mystical references. Jenny Acet Chayo is a Mexican poet who has also been inspired by Jewish mysticism. From Mexico as well, Rubén Bonifaz Nuño and Ernesto Cavi have written poems that reflect on central aspects of the Sephirotic tree, among other themes of Kabbalah. Another author that has been studied in relation to Jewish mysticism is the Mexican poet José Gorostiza, and critics have studied the presence of Kabbalah in the early poetry of the Puerto Rican author Luis Pales Matos and the Brazilian writer Clarice Lispector, although her connection to this topic is less convincing. People are always trying to connect Clarice Lispector to Judaism. It's not there. In terms of art, in addition to Muta confirming and Shul Solar that I discuss in my book, there are other Latin American artists that have been inspired by Jewish mysticism, such as Rosita Kalina and her daughter Ileana Pisk. And we also have illustrations and prints by Esther Gurevich, paintings by Horacio Bodobots, Leonor Koifman, Patricia Krasbush, and the Golem series by Pedro Roth. This group also includes paintings by Carlos Azulay, Adrian Levy in Argentina, Lazar Segal in Brazil, Carlos Poveda, and Carlos Poveda in Colombia. The authors and artists that I selected as the main focus of my book are the ones that have the most significant volume of work related to this topic. But there's still a lot of ground to cover. So I'm inviting you to follow. What continues to pique my curiosity is what these authors and artists' treatment of Jewish mystical themes reveal about their respective creative processes, because they offer a fascinating new dimension to the cultural production of Latin America. They're also a testament to how much the field has grown since Borges entered the Kabbalah garden. But more work needs to be done in this area. It might also prove fruitful to look into how these cultural products relate to literature and art inspired by Jewish mysticism in the US and Israel. Thank you all for walking with me through my esoteric wanderings. I hope that I have demonstrated that there is joy in being lost in the mystical labyrinth of Latin American literature and art. Thank you. I'm open to questions or comments. Ava?
I would like to know how you explain that. Oh, sorry. My question is about how to explain the interest in this material. Maybe you can contextualize it a little bit better, and I have to apologize on behalf of ASU for all the difficulties, the technological difficulty that you had to experience here. But if I'm still not clear, either kind of contextualizing historically, why are these people so interested, and then how do they really use this? Because anybody can write about angels. Any person can mention the sphere of tree. The question is, what do they really know? How well are they embedded in this literary tradition? So if you can unpack that for us, that would be very useful.
Yes, that was actually something that was very important. I searched high and low to find where Jodorowsky got these themes in his writing, to start with one, because he's the only one that's not a scholar, right? So, and he also is the most famous of these authors, Alejandro Jodorowsky. And he's also fascinated with shamanism and all things esoteric. And he even has a book about his teachers in Mexico, and because he reads also a lot of esotericism from the East, you know, Hinduism and other traditions. I could barely find, I found an indirect connection to a teacher of his. So he's definitely not a learned person, and yet there's a figure of the Rebbe, which I didn't get to talk about today, throughout all of his autobiographical writings, where it shows that he clearly has read enough. So if the question is, how did these themes get to their art? When it comes to Jodorowsky, it comes through his main trope of the genealogical tree. He has this, I don't know if you've heard of his, there's a recent movie on his psychomagic therapies, where he has this whole concept of we must chop off arms of our genealogical tree to move on with our lives. He sees our cultural inheritances almost like a burden we need to get rid of. And yet, his literature and art is filled with all these references. In his case, He clearly had a very traumatic relationship with his parents. He hates everything related to Judaism. So it's actually quite interesting that he has so much on this character of the Rebbe. The other three are definitely readers and people who have studied either at Hebrew University in the same classes that you took early on, or teach it. In fact, both Mario Satz and Angelina Muñiz-Huberman have written books specifically on Kabbalah. Muñiz-Huberman, they're not academic in the sense of within the Jewish studies dialogues, but they're academic enough to reach out, to cross over to their readers in Spanish and Latin American contexts. Mario Satz is in Spain and Angelina Muñiz-Huberman is in Mexico. And we call them Mergis also related to his half Jewish and his interest in learning more about the tradition. This is not a topic people know about. The authors are not famous for this. I'm introducing this to the world. This is not a field of study or something that people connect these authors to. In fact, Angelina Muñiz-Huberman is much better known for her early modern themes. She teaches a cátedra. What do we say, cátedra? She teaches at the UNAM early modern literature, Spanish literature. Catedráticas, yeah, she's a professor she's a scholar, and but she's also an author. Did I answer enough? Yes? Yeah?
This is a very new topic for me, so thank you for enlightening us. My question is, do you think there's more evidence of Jewish mysticism in literature than in art? Was that your case?
To be honest, I can't quantify it. I can tell you it's more identifiable. Because I am going in that direction. I'm definitely interested in that list of artists. I'm going to go visit 2 of them in December. I definitely want to study more. It's all abstract modern art. It's a lot harder to grasp the connections, whereas in literature, they're naming. They're using the words, they're naming the topics, they're making references that are just easier to identify from a non-expert perspective. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think that it's possible that some of these things that are like showing up in non-Jewish contexts? Do you think that it's possible that some of these like Kabbalistic themes that are showing up in non-Jewish contexts might be like a result or like a fragment of communities that were forcibly converted to Judaism during the Spanish Inquisition?
To Catholicism, yeah. The Marranos, yeah. That's a gray area for Jewish studies in Latin America. There's a whole other association for, that's a bad word, not actually Marranos. What is the word Cripto-Judíos, thank you. It's a whole other world that I don't know much about. I honestly think it has more to do with New Age religions and popular culture using themes of Kabbalah. And that was actually a big challenge for me, to be honest. People did not take me seriously. They thought I was that's what I was doing at the beginning, because I was just learning and going, finding respectable sources. You run into sources that are not considered respectable. So anyway, when eventually I got the people who know about these things to tell me who's who and who I should be reading, who I should not be reading, it became a lot clearer how these authors were using these topics. In fact, the beginning of my research, all I was doing was identifying the topics, learning about the topics, and trying to figure out how close these authors were recreating to the sources, were recreating the topics, related to the sources in Jewish mysticism. It was once I started reading more Hasidic scholarship that I was able to honestly feel freer to interpret these texts, because what I do is not philosophy. Jewish studies is philosophy, and so in some ways, Hasidic scholarship gave me more tools to do literary criticism and art criticism. It makes absolute no sense, but the believers speak to the secular text better than the seculars, than the secular scholars. Yeah. Yes.
Yes, in the Southwest, as you know, during the conquest, when some of the Spaniards who came over, they were actually Arabs or Jews and so on, and then they were hiding from the Inquisition, and then to hide further, they went up north. And in the Southwest, there's a lot of them. And today, in contemporary Chicano literature or Latino literature, there's a lot of Jewish writers too coming up. I mean, this tradition of just separating, talking about Latin America from the Rio Grande South, I think when you have 67 million people over here, I think you cannot do that anymore. I mean, you also need to come in to see what's being produced over here.
You're absolutely right. However, one of my authors is a Latino living in New York City, so he's not. But yes, you're absolutely right. And the thing is, it's not about how many crypto Jews or Jews live in the U.S. or live in Argentina or live. It's not about what I study. A lot of my authors and artists are not Jewish, right? It's really, and there's a lot of, like, Clarice Lispector was a Jewish author who never wrote about Jewish themes. So our field of Latin American Jewish studies only focuses on Jewish studies written by Latin American and Latinx. So yes, absolutely, Latinx authors are being studied at LACSA for sure. And you're pushing me to look for more in this area, and I will, I promise. I owe you that, yes.
I wanted to ask you about whether you study the contributions of Latino playwrights. You know, you have Sabina Berman, for instance, and Ariel Dorfman. You know, people like that who are they write about Jewish themes in some plays, but not all the time. Ariel Dorfman writes more about the Pinochet dictatorship and so forth. But Sabina does write. I mean, she wrote about the Inquisition in one of her plays. And so anyway, what do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. We have great playwrights. We have compilations of essays. We have Noel Lindstrom has a book, I believe, on Jewish Latin American theater. I teach plays in my class, the class that one of your colleagues took back in the day. When it was taught by somebody else, but the same class. I definitely include theater. We include all forms of art. And Rosenmacher is another great playwright that we teach. Herman Rosenmacher. Yeah, but there's more. Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question, and our apologies again for the PowerPoint catastrophe.
Life happens.
It happens, but it shouldn't. If we move Latin American studies away from the, if we want to, or if we do, move Latin American Jewish studies away from the Borgesian Kabbalistic model and perhaps toward the Benjaminian model, the more politicized model or messianic model, if that's fair. I mean, I'm just reading the Clay and the thesis on the concept of history that you cited. Has there been an uptake of the Benjaminian messianic model in Latin American thought?
That's a big question. Do you think we can connect it with eco-criticism, maybe? Would that be too far of a stretch? But in terms of...
How would you go about doing that?
You're getting me way out of my comfort zone.
I think you could do it through the concept of tikkun olam.
Tikkun olam. Thank you, Hava. Absolutely. Yes. So we're staying within Latin American Jewish studies. I thought you were asking me in Latin American literature in general. But yes, with Tikkun Olam, there's this concept of repair the world. These authors, at least in the ones that I study, definitely think about ways. Some are more pessimistic, some are more optimistic, but in many ways they do think about this big concept of whether there's a future. And that's why I was thinking more outside of Jewish studies. I was thinking about teaching a class on Green Latin America, and it was just so negative and so pessimistic. I just couldn't follow, but I think that there's a lot there that could be done with that. Yeah. But I think that's for someone else to follow.
Just a question about, I understand the connection between the Hasidic and the Kabbalah that you explained. I know several in my own family. So Kabbalists that follow Hasidic. Well, but Kabbalah would be something more like medieval and Sephardim in origin. What is the missing link here?
The missing link.
I never had the perfect answer to this. I can have some, but...
It's 11 of... Yeah, it is interesting. How do I do this?
Okay, so...
Thank you.
I really want to learn about this.
Yeah, a primer here. So the connection is this. You're absolutely right. Kabbalah is Spanish-centered in the Middle Ages, 13th to 15th century. But the 16th century, it shifts eastward to the land of Israel when we have another layer of Kabbalah, another development, and we call it Lurianic Kabbalah, after Isaac Luria. So what you have is a very complex rereading, reinterpretation of the Zohar. I'm sure you heard about the Zohar, which is, obviously a Spanish text. And it's Lurianic Kabbalah that spread in the 16th century and 17th centuries throughout Europe, both to the west, to Amsterdam, where we have the development of Kabbalah there, and to the east, to Poland, Eastern Europe, Ukraine. Okay, so Hasidism is an East European development that took Kabbalistic literature of the 16th century, in some ways democratized it, on some level democratized it, made it, maybe today we will call it popularized it, but in other ways it kind of created another spiritual, it's really like a Jewish renewal type movement. So Hasidism is a renewal movement. It takes a new energy that kind of takes a highly sophisticated, not scholastic, that's not a good word, but speculative literature. It makes it something that you can really live with. So the question is, what gets to Latin America? So Hasidism gets to Latin America in certain ways. I don't believe that the more speculative, scholastic, technical literature gets there. So that was the gist of my question originally. What exactly do they know? How well do they know? I also want to suggest to you that you look into the category of post-secularism. Okay. So what's going on here, it's not just New Age revival, New Age movements, but also post-secularism as a response to all the problems that we are experiencing in the secular world. And kind of it was interesting that you start with your own secularity, but you're dealing with this literature. So.
Yeah, I guess I'm a good example of post-secularism. Exactly. Yes. Yeah, that actually now I understand better what you were asking me. And it also points at something that was another challenge in this project, which is I had to rely on all U.S. and Israeli scholars, right? Because we don't have Latin American scholars that write about Kabbalah. The closest we have is Angelina Muñiz-Huberman. These are people who, are Spanish and Latin Americanists. They're not Jewish studies scholars. What did get there, yes, is Chabad, right? So what got there, what got to Latin America is Hasidic practices, not Hasidic scholarship necessarily. And so, but from what I trace, it's very clear. They all get it they all read Gershom Scholem. That's it. I mean, it's not even, these authors and artists, they're not religious. They're not close to Hasidic culture. They all read Gershom Scholem, Obat, Jodorowsky. Yeah. Svad. Well, one interesting piece that I do cover about when Kabbalah goes to Israel is the Lurianic school within the Lurianic school. It's this idea of it's a Hebrew word, but it's related to what we understand as ghosts. And there's a whole section on what happens to the dead, after we're dead, in Judaism, and this idea of the afterlife, which is mostly not part of Judaism, only very few, like that pins on, there's very few Orthodox groups that would believe in the afterlife. But they do, but there is this idea of the transmigration of souls, and that is something that is very prominent. That is one of the themes that fascinate these authors the most. The D-books and the people being possessed, there's exorcism, and all of these are themes that interested them. This is my next step also. I also have a feeling that there may be something there between these authors' interest in Kabbalah and the boom, magical realism, only because of their age and because there's some mentions, very indirect mentions, and it's something I'm interested in exploring. If there's not some fascination with what's beyond understanding in Kabbalah, that's considered. It can go only so far in trying to reach understanding and connect with the divine. And this part of our culture that is not just a literary boom, but, from Lo Real Maravilloso to the boom and post-boom and where we're now, there's a clear presence of the magical in the Latin American culture and tradition. Yes.
The last book by Eitan Fishbein is precisely on that. How we could understand the Zohar as magical realism.
Yes.
So it's a wonderful analysis of the Zohar according to the literary categories of magical realism.
Yeah, and he's a reader of Borges, right? He writes about Borges as well, I believe. Yeah.
You don't really need Borges to understand the Zohar.
No, you don't need Borges to understand the Zohar, but you do need Borges to understand magical realism, which I think that's where the connection is. Yeah. Look it up.
Just since we're here, what's next for you? What are your next lines of inquiry? And just because of what we were talking about earlier, when we talk about cultural production, you made a really good point, right? So the literature, it's very easy to identify these themes because there are words and because the power of the word to do something, and it's harder to trace in visual arts. Have you been considering musical or other kinds of arts as well? Anyway.
I discovered writing this book how much I like writing about art, but what I didn't realize at the time is that part of the reason why it was so fascinating writing about Shul Solar and Mirta Confirming is that they also write and they also have been written about extensively. And so since my life is about words, I was not just dealing with images. I had something else to bridge me into images. So I have been toying with the idea of going deeper into art, but I am a little, so I think this magical realism is something only because, not only, but because it's interesting how much students actually make you realize what you're interested in. And two of the students that are going to be writing theses next spring are making me go back and read about the trajectory of magical realism. And that's when I started realizing there's a lot there. And I can maybe through magical realism then go back to art. I have written about film quite a bit, as you know. But honestly, it's not my thing. It's not my thing. It's not, I mean, so I have a compilation of essays. Why is it not my thing? I cannot put I feel like there's just, it's a little overwhelming. Alejandro Jodorowsky's films, I do not recommend. I had to watch them all for this book. It was no fun. But that's an extreme, right? I mean, that's surrealist film of the 60s. I mean, we're talking everything. Huh? El Topo, right, yeah. And El Topo is not even, the later book. I tell you, one of the latest films I liked, La Danza Sin Fin. That one I recommend. And it's based on one of the books that I study. I just, the surrealist films of the 60s, it just feels unedited to me. It feels like you're watching, like everything went, right? Like sometimes, I mean, obviously, I'm sure that experts in film can prove me wrong. Please prove me wrong. They're just not fun to watch. I mean, they're not pleasant to watch. And they don't inspire me the way literature and art inspires me. Music may be a place to go. But again, it's like I have to start studying from scratch. Oh. For some reason, art and photography, for those of us who are in literature, we feel confident writing about art and photography, right? Once you venture into music now, it may be a little, you need other language, and skill set. Yes.
Well, if there aren't further questions.
We have one more.
I'm just wondering at the top of my head, if Latin American mysticism in general, is there like a connection in there? Because the only way to understand Latin America is actually through magical realism, because there is no other way around it. And it comes from the fact that you have like the encounter of so many cultures. You have so many pre-Columbian cultures, and all of these cultures are basically, their core belief is actually based in mysticism. So I wonder, if in a way there is a connection between this mysticism all over Latin America as a way to inspire these authors to go back to the mysticism within their own cultural background.
Yeah, that was definitely a case with Jodorowsky. That's how I started. I thought I was going to go into shamanism and, because he studied with curanderas in Mexico and all that. Santeria, absolutely. Yeah, there's definitely a fascinating project there. It's a little scary. Intimidating. It took me 16 years. I'm not sure I have that kind of patience anymore. But yes, and what I like about that, what you're suggesting is that would truly be Latin American. If you really, that would, because you really get into all the different mystical traditions that converge in our culture. Yeah, that's maybe. We'll see. Yeah.
Further questions? If not, then let us all thank our speaker. Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And we'll really thank you for your patience.
If he had gone black, it would have been harder. But the fact that there were little glimpses, I felt confident. You were getting a little bit. So that really helped.